wanted to thank everyone for coming today. I started Lyma 6 years ago at a time in my life when everything had gone wrong. I'd caught septicemia, I was completely at rock bottom, and nothing in the pharmaceutical world or the supplement world at the time could help me gain my strength to function at my normal capacity. And it was a chance meeting when I was actually at a clinic in Geneva where I bumped into Clayton, who was there on a conference, and he introduced me to a category of patented, peer-reviewed ingredients that changed my life at a time when nothing else could. And that was really the birth of Lyma, a supplement that transformed focus, immunity, anxiety, and I added a beauty ingredient in there just because why not, and also sleep. And the company's kind of really gone on from there. In September 2020 we launched the Lyma laser, which Dr. Graeme Glass has been pivotal in developing. And we're just so bowled over the success of the company, how it's gone viral amongst communities that are really struggling when it comes to preventative health. And it was only after launching the trio of products, so the laser, the supplement, and the skincare, that we've started to really do some pioneering epigenetic testing on actually how our protocol works. Not to obviously change your genes, because you can't change your genes, but to change the condition and the way that our genes function as we age. So we'll enter into this presentation now, but we're just really glad to share this information with everybody, and hope that you find some of the takeouts useful. Okay.
Thank you very much, Lucy Goff. I'm very excited to be here today. I'm on a learning curve to host this panel event, really discussing the all-important questions around longevity, the effects of aging inside and out, and how to live 10 years younger. I think I'm actually here as an example of longevity, in that there was the only presenter they could think of who's still working and can just about string a sentence together, so they thought, that'll do, that'll be proof that actually there is life after 50. Actually, the other day I was just thinking about this in terms of longevity and how we think about, getting the most out of our lives. I went for a smear test, and I wrote about this in the Times, so if any of you read it, excuse me for repeating, but I went for this smear test, and I said, oh God, you have to take local HRT for about a week beforehand, so it's not agony, and I went into the nurse's room, and she sort of slipped on her rubber gloves, and she said, well, anyway, plenty to be cheerful about, it's your final smear. And I was like, what do you mean final? That sounds incredibly final. And she said, oh, yes, well, it's very unlikely that women over 65 get cervical cancer or the HPV virus. So you'll be fine, and we don't need to check it anymore. And it just intrigued me, because I sort of thought, why? Well, where's the science behind that? And I went home and delved into it and discovered that 15% of cervical cancers are found in women over 65, that because our sexual habits and our lifestyles have changed dramatically since the 1950s, when that edict was first put out there, there are incredibly compelling reasons to keep testing. But I think the most compelling one of all, frankly, which was what assailed me in that nurse's room, was just the fact that actually, the closer you get to what will be the end, the less you want to go there. And that's just a sort of fact of life. And despite the fact that society and many other aspects of our culture tell us that, there's a certain sort of sell-by date, by which point we should just put up our feet and give up. I think that's absolutely not the case. And we're here today to talk about not just staying alive, if you don't mind me quoting the Bee Gees, but how to do it in a really great way, so that you don't end up being, as I sometimes see, the old person obviously in pain, hobbling down the street, looking twice their age, and not leading their best best possible life. In order to do that, Lyma have assembled an extremely expert panel who I'm now going to foist on them the task of introducing themselves. And if I could start with Professor Paul Clayton, who Lucy referred to briefly there, but he's going to tell us just a little bit about his interest in this topic. Not my smear test, obviously. I'm not expecting you to go down that road, but just life and longevity and your interest in it.
They say if you sit by the river long enough, you'll see the bodies of your enemies float past. And I've been sitting by this particular river for many, many years. I went to medical school in 1968, and the landscape of patients that we have to deal with today is utterly unlike the landscape that we were dealing with back then. So many diseases have become more frequent, and they have become more serious. We see them emerging in progressively younger groups of patients, and I could list you probably 50 different diseases that all show this pattern.
Before you get me too depressed, though, will you just tell me a little bit about you?
About me?
You mentioned briefly...
I'm the least interesting part of this.
Yes, but I want to make sure that you're not a witch doctor or something, but you have the credentials to tell me the secret to eternal life.
Okay. Well, I went to Edinburgh University, and I was handpicked to go off and do a PhD. I had a professorial chair waiting for me at the age of 24 if I wanted one. But unfortunately, I fell out of love with the medical model. I actually fell in love with a veterinary student and started going to her classes and hearing from her teachers how important nutrition was. And when I went back to the medical classes and asked my professor, well, why don't we study this kind of thing, I was told, and remember this was 1968, nutrition, I was told, that's women's work. There's another way in which the landscape has changed. And I didn't find that entirely satisfactory, because my mother was the leading intellectual light in my family. She was, in fact, one of the first epigeneticists. She ran the lab that was set up by Conrad Waddington when he left Oxford at Edinburgh University. So in all the first papers in epigenetics, you'll see my mother's name there. And she went off to become a professor at Kyoto University, so I grew up in a Japanese household. Then, for 10 years, I did all kinds of things. I worked for the government, in a good way, and for the Committee on the Safety of Medicines, which is a forerunner to the regulatory agencies that we have to deal with today. Other things happened. I was for 15 years a fellow at the Institute of Food, Brain and Behaviour at Oxford, working with the great John Stein and Michael Crawford and people like that. And then, oddly enough, I was headhunted by the Institute of Interdisciplinary Medicine in Moscow. So I now live in the United States and commute to Moscow.
You've certainly given me some confidence in everything else you're going to tell us about today. Graeme, I wonder if you could, excuse me, introduce yourself, Dr. Graeme Glass.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. My name is Graeme Glass. I'm a plastic and craniofacial surgeon. I'm also an associate professor of clinical surgery at Cornell University. And I straddle the worlds of clinical surgery and academia because I do both. My clinical practice was based in London. I'm currently in Qatar in the Middle East, and I specialize in children's facial reconstructive surgery. So I do cleft lip and palate, craniofacial deformity, smile surgery for children with facial palsy. I also do lots of facial trauma. And really, as an aside, I do some aesthetic surgery as well, particularly facial aesthetic surgery. Now, from a clinical point of view, I did my PhD in stem cell therapeutics, particularly manipulating stem cells to making the kinds of tissues that we were looking for in the body, especially bone, from a reconstructive point of view. So I did that between 2006 and 2010, before going back into clinical practice again. But it really gave me a sort of a grounding in both, that I've been able to help Lyma grow from the point of view of the scientific and clinical interface. So that's what I'm doing at the moment.
Well, thank you very much. And finally, I mean, we could hear some more from Lucy Goff. We'll definitely hear more from her later.
I failed biology at school, so definitely I'm not the person.
But definitely credentials as a founder of something rather brilliant. Dr. Tamsin Lewis, perhaps you could just tell us a couple of words about yourself, and then I'm going to get Paul Clayton to talk to us about the bad news first. Get it over and done with.
Hi, I'm Dr. Tam, mostly known as Dr. Tam. I trained as a medical doctor here in London, Guy's, King's and St Thomas's hospitals. My postgraduate training was in psychiatry, and I did a BSc in the neuroscience and the biology of aging. This is back in early 2000s. I set up very early on a wellness-focused medical practice, which is now known as WellTech, about 13 years ago now in London, but did a lot of remote practice. And then probably many of my clients came to me and said, have you heard of this supplement Lyma? And so I went down the investigative route of thinking, wow, they've put together a lot of very interesting ingredients. And so I became a big fan. I then worked with Six Senses in Ibiza, setting up a medical wellness longevity centre called Rosebar. Learned a lot there, moved my life to Ibiza with my daughter for a year and a half, and learnt a lot more about wellness medicine, retreats, the importance of the nervous system, connection, mind-body link, etc., etc. And I bring that all together in my practice now.
Well, I think we're all absolutely gagging to hear more from you, especially the stuff that's going to be helpful to us, because we are human beings and therefore deeply selfish. Paul Clayton, one of the things that really struck me is that I've always swallowed what seemed to be the truth, that we're living longer, and that's why it's causing all kinds of problems for society, because there are more of us, etc., etc., etc. But actually, I think that you would dispute that, and we are aging faster than ever before. I said it was bad news, but don't worry, we do have some solutions. But first, tell me about that and why that is, and why we have this kind of erroneous perception of what's happening with the human species.
See, this is the problem. We had a short conversation before this meeting started, and then we started going down the rabbit hole, and things went from bad to worse.
You opened the lid of the rabbit hole, and I jumped in. It's my job.
Okay. Everybody has seen the graph which shows life expectancy increasing in a suspiciously straight line from 1900 to 2000. And it's touted as one of the great successes of modern medicine. It is a complete lie. First of all, 1900 was a nadir, a historical low point in terms of life expectancy for all kinds of cultural and economic reasons. So you're starting from a very low point. Secondly, the increase in life expectancy, statistics is such an elusive subject. Most of that apparent increase in life expectancy is being due to reductions in infant mortality. If you go back to 1900 and the period before that, 1 in 4 children would die before the age of 5. So that brought down average life expectancy. It makes much more sense to look at modal age at death. And there's other ways you can do this. If you take those factors out, the life expectancy increased for a person aged 60 in 1900 is almost exactly the same as it is now. The last time I looked, by about 2000, that had only increased by about 2 years. Since 2000, in case you hadn't noticed, life expectancy has been going nowhere but backwards. It started falling first in the United States, then it started to appear in Britain. It's been going on for 5 and 4 years respectively, and it's no coincidence that these are the 2 countries in the world which have the greatest penetration of ultra-processed foods. They accelerate the aging process. For one thing, they're directly involved in this extraordinary increase we've seen in type 2 diabetes. And type 2 diabetes is a medical complication which accelerates the aging process. Once you've been diagnosed, no matter what treatment you get, unless you change your lifestyle in order to get the foundations right, you will lose about 6 or 7, maybe 8 years of life expectancy. It accelerates the whole aging process. And that's just one example. There are many, many others. The picture, ladies and a few gentlemen, is unremittingly grim. This is a series of public harms that we're doing to ourselves, or we are allowing to be done to ourselves. And here at Lyma, we are dedicated towards undoing some of those harms.
Well, before we start looking at that in more detail, I wonder if you could give us an explanation of the science that it sounds like your mother pioneered, but epigenetics, what is it? What does it mean, and how does it relate to this?
as Lucy said, you can't change your genes. The genetic hand of cards that you're given at conception is the one you remain with a few very special exceptions. But the way in which your genes are expressed, the way in which they actually function during different parts of your life, that isn't set. Epigenetics is the science that describes the way in which the activity of your different genes fluctuates. And it fluctuates in response to different foods that you eat, different levels of stress that you experience, different levels of physical exercise. It's a buffering system between your genes, which are unchangeable, and your environment, which is completely changeable. Think of it as a buffering system. The very first lab of epigenetics was set up by a pioneering scientist called Conrad Waddington, who is one of my godfathers. I have a selection of godfathers. And my mother was the lead scientist in his research unit, which was set up at the University of Edinburgh. I was probably conceived on a laboratory bench myself, because my father worked in the laboratory next doors.
I can see the movie of your life playing out here, yeah.
So epigenetics is really important because it takes your genetic potential and it describes how well you can express it, whether that potential will be realized or whether it'll be strangled, and as a result you will suffer health consequences. Now, it turns out that we have constructed a lifestyle and an environment which is epigenetic extremely hostile, and so it is attacking us at a near genetic level. And we see this in terms of the accelerated aging, the increasing frequency in chronic degenerative disease, and the decreasing latency of these diseases. Almost all of them are emerging in younger and younger groups of patients, with the exception of the neurodevelopmental diseases, and they're spiraling out of control. I mean, they can't get any younger, but we're seeing far more of them. The overall picture is extraordinarily negative.
Well, you keep ending on a rather gloomy note. I'm hoping that Dr. Graeme can lift our spirits a little bit. But
the solution.
First, we have to, I suppose, just dig into how epigenetics affects things like skin and appearance.
Yes, okay. So most people are probably familiar with the idea that you have, that skin is manifests as part of the aging process, okay? And you may or may not have read that there is intrinsic aging and extrinsic aging, where intrinsic aging is your genes expressing themselves by way of tissue repair processes and so on, which over time, break down and function less well. Whereas extrinsic aging is what you do to yourself that results in harmful or in harm to the tissue reparative processes. So things like smoking, drinking, not getting enough sleep, and so on. We were talking earlier that's probably an oversimplification of the process. And if you understand epigenetics, it kind of wraps up this thing in a much more satisfactory way. For example, as a plastic surgeon, I deal with skin, and there's no doubt that the different. It never ceases to amaze me how people of different ages can have such different quality of skin. There are people in their 50s and 60s who are actually expressing quite youthful skin, and people in their 30s and 40s who really the skin quality is very poor. This can be explained, just as Dr. Paul said, by epigenetic factors. So yes, you cannot change your genes. Everyone has a different genetic potential, but these genes are large units of digital information, which are highly conserved by copy, but are not best placed to adapt to slight environmental changes. Epigenetics is the analog system that allows subtle changes in to manifest as skin reparative processes, and by addressing the epigenetic the potential of your tissues, you can not only stop the aging process, but to a certain extent you can actually reverse it as well. And this brings us on to the purpose, really, in essence, of what Lyma is all about.
I wonder if I could just bring you in, Dr. Tam, just in terms of, I mean, we've heard from Paul that we're all doomed. Graeme's taking a slightly more optimistic view of what can happen. That's what I was told. Don't worry, I haven't got COVID, by the way, I've tested. Just a cough. But seeing as it all started to go wrong around the 1940s, you know, is it just a trajectory where we're all going to hell in a handcart, or how do you perceive the situation at the moment as outlined by your two predecessors in this conversation?
I've been fascinated by the science of epigenetics just because the rapidity of how you can so basically the expression of certain genes, the dynamism of that is quick, right? You can effectively de-age in days if we're looking at DNA methylation processes. So for example, like some of you go on holiday and everyone's like, wow, you look so much younger because you look more rested. You know, that is all in a way, epigenetic processing, right? You're de-stressing, you're affecting what we'll talk about, the actual process of epigenetics, DNA methylation. So I do think this process, the aging process, is modifiable if you're given the right tools, technologies, education, so people can put things in their daily life. We can't all go to the Caribbean, you know, once a month just to sort of, you know, become epigenetically younger. But we can do red light therapy, Lyma laser. We can have, you know, functional foods in our diet. We can acknowledge the impact of pollution on our skin. But there is a way of offsetting the life that we live or have to live until we all go and live in our social wellness farms near Lisbon or whatever. But I do see that the offset to our daily life is an exciting field that I try and work with people on.
Let's talk also then a bit about diet and inflammation, which are two, you know, really big contributing factors, which again, you know, as you've just alluded to, you can do things about.
Yes, I think quality of food is super important. I think the quality of our food in these busy city environments can be, you know, detrimental, you know, poor compared to, you know, for example, if you're in the go back to the Caribbean, but wherever, you know, the quality of our food really matters. So I think it's worth spending a bit of money on well-sourced foods, you know, organic, etc., tend to be more nutrient-dense. So diet plays an essential part. The quality of your water you drink, you know, you could filtered water, preferably not in plastic. All of those things have an impact on our microbiome, our gut health, which is how we essentially sense our environment, how we metabolize how we metabolize and extract nutrients from our food.
And Graeme, does what's happening with our microbiome affect our skin as well, our outward appearance?
Yes, it does, and perhaps Paul can explain it better than I can, but in direct and in indirect ways. What happens in a microbiome is integral to the inflammatory processes that are going on in our body, and there's no doubt that inflammatory processes are highly epigenetically toxic. Especially chronic inflammatory states. Now, I draw the distinction between chronic inflammatory states from acute inflammatory states because there is a reason for the acute inflammatory response, and that is to protect us from adverse events, to protect us from infections, to protect us from tissue injury. It's all our reparative processes are generated by the inflammatory response. But a chronic inflammatory state is highly detrimental to our health. And changes in our gut microbiome, translocation of adverse bacteria, the circulation of toxic proteins and lipopolysaccharides is highly disadvantageous to us. And so, yes, these do affect our epigenetic health in an adverse way.
So give us a prescription, Paul. What do we need to do, and can we eat our way younger?
You can certainly...
give it your best shot.
You can alternate between a fast-track aging and slow-track. And we are at the point now where that's actually very easy to do. So chronic inflammatory stress...
Sorry, I'm not sure what that...
It's because Paul, it's under his microphone.
He hasn't touched it.
It's on the side, yeah.
Oh.
If I do this, is that better?
I think so, yes, sorry.
Okay, so chronic inflammatory stress is quite fashionable. I think everybody thinks they know what it is. And it undoubtedly is important in driving most and perhaps all of the non-communicable chronic degenerative diseases. Amongst other things, it drives the destruction of the extracellular matrix, which is an organ in its own right. It's these 300 or so different microfibers that run all the way through you and hold you together, hold your cells together, and give you form and therefore function. So if you have chronic inflammatory stress, that starts to break down. And of course, if that's in the skin, that shows as skin aging. But if it's occurring elsewhere in the body, it can translate into osteoporosis or osteoarthritis, or it could be it's involved in autoimmune diseases, all those things. So we want to stop chronic inflammatory stress, and there are certain very easy ways of doing that. When it comes to accessing that in the skin, there are actives, very specific actives, that we use to achieve exactly that. And immediately you switch off chronic inflammatory stress in the skin, you start to see very significant epigenetic improvements. Because then the cells in the skin, fibroblasts and immune cells and all kinds of other cells, start working as they were designed to do, instead of being chronically impaired, which they are today because of the way in which we live. I mean, my contemporaries in Florida, the sun's pretty fierce there. They have skin like paper. And all you have to do is to brush against a corner, and they start to bleed. You've seen old people like that. They bleed under the skin. They become very, very fragile. That's actually telling you that the extracellular matrix in the dermis and the subdermis has become very degraded. They've become extraordinarily fragile, and that same fragility, when you look inside them, you see it in every other organ system as well. This is a big part of why people age and die. I don't look exactly the way that they do. I'm far older than you.
Only a little bit. I've been doing the maths, and frankly, yeah, you look a lot better than I do. So that's why I'm listening so raptly to every word you say.
Look after the extracellular matrix, stop chronic inflammation, reverse dysbiosis. Again, very easy to do. Prevent glycemic mismatch, which is all about the metabolic problems of eating too much sugar and digestible carbs and not taking enough exercise. Get those things right.
Okay, steady. That's a lot of stuff that, like, a lot of us might be thinking, oh, I need to write it down for a start. But also, where do you start? You know, does it mean that you should give up meat? Does it mean, you know, there's so many things that we're told on a regular basis.
No, worldwide and throughout history, meat consumption has been associated with better health and longevity. There is undoubtedly an agenda being played out at the moment by people who have a political inclination telling us not to eat meat. And you can make an environmental or an ecological case for that if you wish. There is not a good health one. The Victorians, the mid-Victorians, ate so much meat that they were known by the French, as you might know, as les roast beef, because they ate so much beef. The British soldiers were eating 1 to 2, 3 pounds of beef a day. I've looked at the public health statistics of that period. They had better health expectancy than we do. They didn't cook their meat in the same way that we do. If you barbecue it or use very high temperature processes, you form what are known as cooked meat carcinogens and other compounds which are not very good for you. Victorians experienced fuel poverty. They didn't have induction hobs and things like that. They boiled almost all of their food, and that never gets above 100 degrees centigrade, obviously. And typically they'd add onions, which happen to contain sulfur compounds which inhibit the development of these compounds. If you cook your meat in the right way, it's not a health risk at all. I'm sorry, I could go on, but I won't.
No, we're here to listen to you. But I also want to hear Dr. Tam on this, because I know it's an area that you're deeply invested in terms of diet and how we can actually change what's happening with our bodies. I have to say, I had a really good example of it, quite a few years ago when I went to a place called Yotown in Devon and ate for the first time in my life kind of really exceptionally great food. There wasn't any meat, but actually, funnily enough, they've come around to eating meat, the founders, as they get older as well. But just to realise that, you could have 7 different colours on your plate and they could all be delicious, and I ate like a pig when I was there. I thought it was there to lose weight. And I left a week later thinking, or 5 days later thinking, yeah, nothing happened, but, why would it? I was stuffing my face. And a week later, something just changed in my whole body. I felt completely different. My stomach went flat, but it wasn't just that. It was just that it felt like everything was was working. Does that make sense?
It's interesting. I'm a big fan of Yo10 as well because of the simplicity. They take things out, right? They take out additives and dairy and alcohol and stimulants, etc. But yeah, I think, like I said, diet quality is super important. I don't usually advocate a vegetarian diet because I do think that as we age, we need to maintain muscle mass. We need to become anti-fragile. In order to do that, we need a significant amount of amino acids in order to drive muscle protein synthesis to keep us strong and to stop us falling over. So, but, you know, people go vegetarian for ethical reasons. So, but protein, even from plant-derived sources, is a super important one. Preferably non-processed, as Paul said, because you can get changes to the microbiome there. So I do think it's very interesting how different diets work for different people. I have had quite a few conversations with Professor Tim Spector, who's running Zoe, some of you have probably heard, that does a blood sugar monitor, tests your poop, so it correlates your blood sugar responses with your the ecosystem in your gut. And that shows that, you know, we're not the same, right? How you react to that salad is not how I'm going to react to that salad. And I think we're going to be getting to the stage in in a year or two where we'll be able to get a bit more prescriptive about what our actual selves need, or what we're craving, what our ecosystem is craving. But as Paul and I was talking about before this conversation, we still don't know what a healthy microbiome in these environment for what is a healthy microbiome in a certain environment. So we know that a diverse microbiome, if that's the population of different bacteria, fungi, parasites in the gut, is important, but we don't know quite yet what that looks like, and even more how to build that. Probiotics don't seem to come in and stick, for example. But I think companies like Zoe, who are collating a lot of data, a lot of deep data on people and making that public, will change how we fundamentally think. But, you know, this has to go back to food policy, which we also talked about. And people need to have an awareness that, you know, your Pret sandwich is full of 17,000 different additives that might have an actual toxic, so a suicidal effect on your microbiome.
And then, Paul, sedentary lifestyles. I mean, it's interesting because, you know, everyone you meet in a certain milieu, you know, is wearing lycra and headed to a gym or a class or a whatever. But actually, the truth of the matter, I think, is far more worrying, which is that we aren't actually doing enough.
Well, our society is a very heterogeneous one. And if everyone you know is wearing lycra and heading off to the gym, I think you may be flocking with your own kind.
It's West London, love.
I'm afraid the overall statistics are telling us a different picture. What they're saying is that we are getting more sedentary and we're getting heavier. Actually, levels of physical activity have probably bottomed out. And with the more recent immersive video computer games, which actually do involve physical activity, that we're beginning to see activity levels start to climb up from a historically low point. We are probably the least physically active generation of humans that has ever lived. And we pay a heavy metabolic price for that. So yes, building more physical activity into your lifestyle is important. Or you can hack it. You can take exercise in a capsule. But we're not here to discuss that.
Well, actually, we are, in a way, because one of the things I wanted to talk about was, you know, with the advent, you know, I've done a lot of campaigning around menopause, but I think there's been a lot of campaigning generally about, you know, how people are viewed in middle age. And so, of course, along with that comes a kind of commercial, imperative to provide products for those people. And there are all kinds of things now available. For example, you know, I don't know how many times I've been sent a box of collagen supplements that apparently, if I take them, will instantly turn me into Dorian Gray in the attic. And nothing's changed. So I've slightly given up taking them. But there are, you know, red light is another thing, isn't it? You know, red light, they're sold on Amazon. You can buy every kind of different kind of red light possible. But does any of that work? Because what I want to do is go on to then talk about what does, because that would be a nice takeaway, wouldn't it?
Well, there are some things that work. I don't want to be, you know, the most negative person here.
I'm afraid you're already winning that one.
Don't pay me into that corner. Collagen doesn't work. It can't work. Or it's very, very limited effects because there's over 300 different fibers that hold you together. Collagen, there's a family of collagens, but that's only a very small subset. You need much more than that to rebuild the ECM, as it's known to its friends, the extracellular matrix. Very, very sexy subject matter. So collagen isn't really very effective. Most of the supplement market is a complete waste of money. If you talk to the Cochrane Collaboration, this is an international gathering of the good and the great who vet these things, they will tell you without hesitation, fish oil doesn't do anything. It has no effect whatsoever. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about Omicor, which is the pharmaceutical version, or whatever Holland and Barrett sells. It has no benefit whatsoever. And the other major sector in the supplement industry, vitamins and minerals, they have no benefits either. The biggest studies have repeatedly shown their benefits are absolutely marginal. You have to do a lot of statistical manipulation to find anything positive out of there at all. So most of that market is junk, which is why medical professionals would prefer not to have any involvement in it. However, there are small sparks in this dark night, and what we do is we collect them. There are various actives that we know now and various technologies that we know, which in the middle of all of this therapeutic nihilism actually do exert consistent and positive effects, and those are the ones that we focus on. We have to be evidence-based. If we're not, what we're doing is not science, it's marketing. And there's enough of that. And I think that when you get to know Graeme, you'll realize that he is typical of the best kind of medic. We have a duty of care to people who cannot care for themselves. And that filters through, I think, in all of the work that we do. So there is really good science being done out there. A lot of it is hard to access. A lot of it is hard to understand. And our job is to find the good stuff and bring it to you and say, this is something that will help.
Well, Graeme,
positive enough?
Yeah, that was beautiful. That was beautiful. It's like we've gone on a journey and we come out into the light at the end, which is exactly where I wanted to be, so thank you. Graeme, could you explain then, obviously Lyma do supplements, but everything to do with Lyma says scientifically proven, and that actually, I think, for most consumers, particularly, in an economic crisis and in cash-strapped days, really, really matters. And I wonder if you can explain how the science works for the laser, how the science works for the supplements, and what happens.
Okay, so take the laser, for example, okay? That's a good place to start, and it's something that I know a lot about. The laser works, and it works through a process called photobiomodulation. Now, you're probably all familiar with a number of LED devices, and all sorts of things are out there promising the earth in terms of what these things can do. Like all of these things, what's happened is that there was some basic scientific evidence, and on that basic scientific evidence there was some clinical evidence, and it builds up into a body of information that allows you to make to extrapolate to things that are likely to actually work, okay? The problem is that the industry largely has extrapolated too far. What's happened is that they have all of this evidence, what we call preclinical evidence, so using human tissue, using human cells, using animal models, have looked at near-infrared laser light and the effect that near-infrared laser light has on the epigenome of the tissue that it comes into contact with. And what they've said is, well, hang on a minute. That's not really commercializable. But what is commercializable? Well, actually, we've got these LEDs. They're really, really cheap. And what does it matter if it's not a laser? It's an LED, all right? Okay, it's got the same wavelength. So we'll build a whole industry around LED-based light therapy, because how different can it really be from the laser light on which most of the evidence is based? Well, actually, it can be quite a difference. To explain a little bit, I'm not going to get into too much detail about laser light versus LED. Suffice to say that when light hits a medium, in this case, skin, it does one of three things. It either reflects off it transmits through it, or it is absorbed by it. The type that what we are interested in is absorption of light, okay? And there is evidence to say that the way that laser light is absorbed by tissues is different from the way that LED-based light is absorbed through tissues. LED-based light, the energy of LED-based light drops off exponentially as it passes through tissue, so that within the first few micrometers, the energy is sufficiently low that it probably doesn't do anything. So that's not to say that the LED-based light doesn't do anything at all. It probably it gives you a glow, makes you feel nice and rosy, and it does so because it works in the first few micrometers, and it probably causes a bit of vasodilation towards the skin surface. So far, so good. What we're talking about, though, is fundamentally rebuilding the extracellular matrix, which is in the dermis, the metabolically active part of the skin. And in order to rebuild the extracellular matrix, we've got to influence, in a positive way, the epigenome of the cells that help build it. The principal cell of which is the fibroblast, but there are also immune cells and so on involved as well. And there is very good evidence that a near-infrared laser light can do this. So it sounds incredible, but actually the science behind it is sound. And the science behind it has been around since the early 1960s, but is only beginning to become, the complicated molecular processes that underpin it are only beginning to become realized. Hence, the clinical applications are going to improve all the time. So that's that, Mariella, is the explanation for the laser light.
Well, I can give. This is so annoying. Sorry, I can give anecdotal evidence on the laser light because I gave one to my very sad best friend just before Christmas. Her husband left her, and she got breast cancer. It was just like a double whammy. It was just so hideous. And I saw her 2 days ago. I haven't given her this laser that I really wanted, but I thought, well, I'll lend it to her for 3 months and see what happens. So she took the supplements, used the laser. She looks about 12. I'm so angry that I didn't keep hold of it. I tried to wrestle it off her yesterday, but couldn't get it back. But I mean, honestly, I am the world's biggest cynic, and judging by the transformation in my very old friend, I just have to say, I think it really works. I wanted to get Lucy to talk briefly about the supplements, but I'm also conscious that I want to get some questions oh my God, from any of you, if you want to ask them before you have to dash off back to work. So maybe someone could ask a question about the supplements, and then that would be killing two birds with one stone.
Or the laser.
Or the laser, or anything else that we've talked about today. Anyone got a question? Hi. Are you talking about the laser? So, yeah. Would it help cure eczema as well?
Okay, so we've got to be rather careful about talking therapeutic effects, okay? Because for licensing and so on. What I will say is that there is good evidence that near-infrared laser light does modulate the inflammatory response. It's one of the so there are roughly two types of inflammatory cells which are active. There's actually many types, but let's stick to two. There are something called Langerhans cells, and Langerhans cells are the only cells which are active in the epidermis, and they migrate between the epidermis and the dermis, carrying information with them. There's also dendritic cells which are resident within the dermis, and they mop up problems within the dermis, and they communicate with these are cells of what we call the innate immune response, and they communicate with cells of the adaptive immune response. Eczema is a problem of disordered inflammation in essence. And the near-infrared light does modulate the inflammatory response, which overwhelmingly is anti-inflammatory in its nature. So there is theoretical belief that it will. It is certainly worth a try, and there is also no theoretical reason why it would make things worse.
Thank you very much. Paul, do you want to have a quick word about the supplements? Because you've talked about things that don't work, so I thought I'd give you the opportunity to talk about things that do.
Well, if you're talking specifically about eczema, there is an inflammatory component, a chronic inflammatory component, as there is in most of the other diseases which currently disfigure the public health space. So anything you can do to reduce that is likely to reduce the burden of public health. Now, if you're talking about skin, well, the aging of the skin, a large part of that is extrinsic. A large part of it is caused by exposure to ionizing radiation, known as the sun. Cigarettes won't help. They induce inflammatory stress as well. And if you're diabetic, that creates inflammatory stress through a different mechanism. And all of those sorts of things are associated with skin that looks older than it biologically should be. So if we can interfere with that and modulate it, as we now can, using biologically active compounds, we work with natural compounds, which the body is familiar with and knows how to deal with, so we don't have to worry about toxic effects. And with the laser, by combining those things, what we're seeing are some really remarkable befores and afters. And your friend, who has, I don't know how old she was, you've said specifically...
56.
And she can now pass for 12, you say?
12, 13, give or take. I mean, it's astonishing.
I've heard and seen so many cases like that. I mean, this really is remarkable. I think we're redrafting the rules. It's very clear that we age as we pass through time or as it passes through us. But the rate at which you experience that is very malleable. That can be changed. And we have now a set of tools that we can use to achieve just that.
See, I said there'd be some good news. Any other questions that anyone would like to ask? I was going to talk a little bit about stress as well and how that's a contributing factor, but I think probably all of you know that already and are probably feeling quite stressed because you've got to get back to work or something. So we could skip stress, or we could talk about it, or you could give one of the expert panel another question for them to mull over. Don't be shy. Yes?
I was interested recently thinking about young people using like sort of anti-aging skin products.
Yes.
So using techniques like Botox at quite a young age. I'm just interested in what you guys think about how that can impact skin and whether it could actually age it faster.
Okay.
Graeme.
Okay, so I think really there's two strands to that question, if I may. I think that the first one is about the idea that people who are younger and younger and younger before they are becoming interested in the aging process. That to me is a good thing. Okay, I think the idea that why wait until the damage has already happened before you want to do something about it? Okay, so I think there is no low age limit to becoming interested about about your skin health and about tissue repair and regeneration. So no problem with that. The second part of your question really was about Botox and fillers, really. So firstly, fillers. Fillers are largely done very badly. It's predicated on the idea that we lose volume as we age. As you probably just heard from our panel discussion, losing volume is just the thin end of a very large wedge. And pumping the face full of fillers to increase volume carries with it its own problems. And sometimes these problems can be very disfiguring. I think we probably all know somebody who's had too much filler. Not only does it look unnatural, but it can be quite disfiguring. And it can be difficult to get rid of, depending upon the filler used. All Botox does is it stops a muscle working for a few months, okay? So the idea with Botox is that you can stop wrinkle formation happening by stopping the underlying muscles moving. Hopefully, in the context of the discussion that we've had, you realize that actually stopping muscles moving is a pretty bad way of causing tissue, skin, and particularly dermal regeneration. There are better ways to address the problem, and the better ways to address the problem is to focus on the extracellular matrix and to do what we can to help rebuild it, prevent damage, and regenerate what has already been lost. The age at which we should start to do this, well, we start to age in our early 20s. So yes, you're right in the sense that we should be looking at this as an issue from an early age. It's the solution that differs.
It's interesting, isn't it, Dr. Tam? Because I have a 19-year-old daughter and she's got completely flawed skin, and she goes like this, and she goes, look, it'd be much better if I just had a little... And we're like, what are you talking about? It doesn't, you don't look any different. I pull my face and I look very different. And there is this sort of... I think, obsession with the superficial appearance. Yeah. But all of the things that we've been talking about today are to do with, working with what's already inside you. And that feels like a much more holistic way of approaching it. And I wonder how easy you think that is to get through to a younger generation who kind of, I suppose maybe it's part of the impatience of youth, want a quick fix. And, my daughter certainly doesn't want to talk to me about her gut health, or, she just wants to eat a pizza because she's at uni and it's cheap.
I think the children today, obviously, they're exposed to a lot more information than we were in terms of social media, in terms of filters and face tunes and all of we've had a shift societally of what normal looks like. And so, people, when they actually go and meet people in person, they don't look like their online presence. So I think that is problematic, and I think there needs to be a bit more education and non-filtering by people that your daughter's age are actually listening to and observing. I think it's helpful if they, and I have noticed a shift in the aesthetic industry because I get invited a lot more to these things now, looking at holistic changes in that can improve skin regeneration, etc., and how to work with the body rather than stuffing it full of things that ultimately cause a reaction which then make you look different. So I think there is a public policy element there, and obviously Instagram influencers, if they can really shift their focus away from face tuning towards feeding, fueling, away from Ozempic face, for example. It's another one that really worries me, is this culture of injecting Ozempic so that we can all be thinner and not eat, and therefore essentially become malnourished. People are scrimping on protein, they're living on nuts and avocados, and that is problematic as well. I think there needs to be, we can't all be over fasting and under fueling consistently, because all our body tissues are made of amino acids, fats, proteins, etc. So I think there's a lot that needs to be changed in the way that we present information to people.
Well, I feel like this is a discussion that could continue forever, but I think before you go, I'd just like to hear from Lucy about why you founded Lyma, because it was not because you thought you wanted to look younger. It was, much more deep-rooted than that, and I think you're very committed to things that work, things that are scientifically proven, not the snake oil sales.
Yeah, I think, I'm 51 now, and, the way I can see how my friends look, and I can see the impact that living younger has had on me, but through the expert advice that I have been privy to, that I've been fortunate to have been privy to. And I think that there's so much misinformation out there from brands that are allowed to say things that are blatantly not realistic. There's huge swathes of the industry that are saying things that are categorically not true, and they're able to con consumers into going down a path that is just not going to benefit them. And I think, I started Lyma with the ethos of providing the best science, the most powerful products and the most in the fewest products available. And there's so much that we could say that we're just not allowed to say because we are not legally allowed to say it. Yet the mass industry is allowed to say things that are not true because they get round their formulations by just putting an A to Z of vitamin and minerals in there. So they can make huge claims against like heart health, bone health, all these things that are not true. Whereas, with Lyma, we have always remained true to what we can deliver. Yet because we don't formulate with a standard A to Z of vitamin, we can't make the same health claims that other brands can make. But our formula can do way more. It can truly anti-inflame your body. It can help you get 8 hours sleep. It can raise your serotonin levels. There's an ingredient in our formula that has been proven to be more effective than fluoxetine and citalopram, yet with 0 side effects. We can't say any of these things, and that's why we rely on people taking it, feeling the benefit, and then telling all their friends. We were not formulated as a menopausal supplement at all, but by far the biggest tranche of demographic that we have changed their lives have been the perimenopausal woman, where it's the first time in a person's life that things have started to go wrong since adolescence. And it's a scary time, and you're targeted with all these different concoctions, and it's like they can't really do much. So I think that having the ability, it's what you were saying about changing legislation, about empowering consumers to have the best information, and it's through education that we're really going to change the problem. I remember when I met Paul Clayton originally, he'd said that in the Victorian age, people were eating over 4,000 calories a day. They were eating a really nutrient-dense diet, but they were working those calories off by walking to work, working in fields, being far more active. And there's such a level of disnutrition at the moment by people who are not eating properly, not eating enough, not eating the right foods, and just relying on marketing to kind of sweep them through life. And hopefully with Lyma, we've helped a very small bunch of people in the wider problems that we're facing.
And I think I speak for Lucy when I say I think you're very open and desirous of feedback. So I can see you've all got a lovely Lyma goodie bag. We'd love to hear back from you about your thoughts about it, because it really is important to you that it's something that actually works. Paul has one last thing to say, and he's promised it's going to be incredibly optimistic and you're going to be uplifted as you walk out the door.
We started with epigenetics, but then we sort of lost the thread. I just wanted to reassure you that we've been looking at this, we've been studying it, and we've done some preliminary investigations, and we've been looking at the activity of different genes that are important in determining the health and functionality of your extracellular matrix. The matrix, remember, is what determines the thickness, the tensile strength, the viscoelasticity of your skin, the bloom, everything. So we looked at a whole array of genes. This was in human skin. What we found was that using our combinatorial approach, all of the genes which are involved in expressing or developing proteins that build the matrix and restore it, they were all activated, and there's a handful of genes which are involved in creating proteins which degrade it, and they were all downgraded. So that's exactly what you want to see. What we also found, 2 more things happened which are extraordinarily positive. First of all, the telomeres in the cells suddenly got a whole lot longer than we were before. So we are reversing aging in a most fundamental way. And the third thing that happened, which we were hoping to see, and I think Graeme probably expected to see more than me, we found that numbers of mitochondria in those skin cells had doubled. We're triggering a phenomenon known as mitochondrial biogenesis, or some people call it neogenesis. So the cells now have more energy to work with. They look more like the way they did when you were 12 or 13. And so does your skin. This is very profound. No one has really done anything like this yet. I think we're actually rewriting the textbooks at this point.
think that photograph speaks for itself. That's what I want, and that's what I'm going for once I get that laser back from Nat. Well, then you can all come back and look at my arms in a month's time. How's that for a promise? Thank you very, very much indeed for attending today. I've really enjoyed listening to the panel. I feel like I've learned an awful lot. But there's still so much more to dig into, and I hope you feel inspired rather than tired at the thought of all the things that you need to do just to live fitter, better, longer, healthier lives. But I can definitely assure you that when you get to my age, you really think, I wish I had, or I'd like to more, and you want to be around as long as you possibly can in a healthy way. And I think anything that can contribute to that, desperately important, and Lyma definitely is one of those really invaluable tools. Thank you.